The U.S. government spends $7.8 billion annually fighting drug cartels. Here's the problem. Every dollar strengthens them. There are 5 mechanisms controlling this system, and we're deep into mechanism 3, where enforcement becomes profit margin. Watch what happens at a border checkpoint. Border Patrol seizes 10 tons of cocaine, street value $300 million. Press conference, congressional testimony. Major victory in the drug war. Meanwhile, that same month, 90 tons crossed successfully through other corridors. Those 90 tons were going to sell for $2.7 billion at baseline prices. But because supply just contracted 10%, street prices rise 15% over the next 6 weeks. The 90 tons now sell for $3.1 billion. The interdiction cost taxpayers $50 million in operation costs, detention, and prosecution. The cartels netted $400 million in margin expansion. You funded both sides. This isn't a drug war. It's a margin protection program with badges. The question isn't whether cartels can be stopped. It's whether anyone notices we built the machine that makes them unstoppable before your tax bill for this failure hits $10 billion annually. This is mechanism 1 of 5, the empty core paradox. Here's why this matters to you. You're paying $7.8 billion in taxes annually for drug enforcement. That money doesn't reduce cartel power, it creates it. Every interdiction raises street prices. Every seizure expands their margins. You're funding both sides of a war where victory means the enemy gets richer. The boardroom truth: cartels don't manufacture the product, don't create the demand, don't control the retail distribution. They control the one infrastructure segment neither government nor legal business can operate. Bulk cash repatriation at scale. Prohibition era 1925. Bootleggers didn't own distilleries, didn't farm grain, didn't run speakeasies. They controlled one thing: distribution corridors the government made illegal, creating 400% margins where legal beer had been 8%. Mexican cartels replicated the model exactly. They don't grow coca in Colombia, don't synthesize fentanyl precursors in China, don't distribute retail in Philadelphia. But they own the infrastructure that moves $400 billion in cash the banking system legally cannot touch. Here's how the business model works. A kilo of cocaine costs $500 to produce in Colombia. It sells for $75,000 on U.S. streets. Now that's a 15,000% markup. But cartels don't touch 80% of that value chain. Farmers grow it, chemists process it, street dealers distribute it. Addicts create demand. The cartel controls one bottleneck, moving $400 billion in street-level cash back across the border and into spendable currency. That's it. That's the entire franchise. Let me be completely clear about how the trap works. U.S. banking regulations, the Bank Secrecy Act, and anti-money laundering rules require reporting for any cash transaction over $10,000. Structuring smaller deposits to avoid reporting is a federal felony. A single street corner in Philadelphia generates $50,000 in cash weekly. Scale that across 20 million regular users, and you have $400 billion in annual street-level transactions. That cash has to go somewhere. No, it can't go into banks without triggering suspicious activity reports. It can't be wired internationally without treasury monitoring. It can't be converted to assets without creating paper trails. So cartels built their own infrastructure. Armored cars disguised as commercial vehicles. Warehouses with $50 million counting facilities. Tunnels under the border with rail systems and ventilation. Currency exchanges that process $100 million monthly. Semi-submersibles carrying $10 million in cash south while drugs go north. The empty core: they don't add economic value. They're a transaction cost on a black market the U.S. government created by prohibiting banking access. Remove prohibition, and the margin and the cartel disappears overnight. Here's what this means for you. In that cannabis legalization in Colorado dropped street prices 70% in 5 years. The cartels that used to move 500 tons of marijuana through that corridor simply vanished, not arrested, not defeated. They quit because the margin went from 800% to 40%. Legal businesses can't compete with cartels on illegal products, but cartels can't compete with legal businesses on legal products because they have to hide cash flows. But here's the problem. The paradox creates its own protection. The bigger the enforcement budget, the more valuable cartel infrastructure becomes. DEA spending rose from $2.1 billion in 2010 to $3.1 billion in 2024. Border Patrol drug interdiction went from $3.2 billion to $4.7 billion. Those increases don't shrink the problem. They raise the price of cartel services. Every new drug-sniffing dog, every checkpoint, every surveillance drone increases the value of owning the infrastructure that evades them. Think of it like this. If you're running a tunnel operation that costs $50 million to build and border enforcement doubles, you don't shut down. You double your fee. Customers, cocaine traffickers, have no choice. They're locked in. Demand is inelastic. So enforcement costs becomes revenue opportunity. You might be thinking, but we have to enforce the law. We can't just let drugs flood in. Here's the problem with that assumption. You already are. Enforcement intercepts 10 to 15% of cocaine shipments. That's DEA's own data. The other 85% crosses successfully. But here's the kicker. That 10 to 15% interdiction rate is optimal for cartels. It's not high enough to disrupt operations, but it's high enough to create artificial scarcity that raises prices. If interdiction dropped to 5%, street prices would fall and margins would compress. If it rose to 30%, cartels would simply shift to higher concentration products, which is exactly what happened with fentanyl. The current enforcement level is a Goldilocks zone, just enough pressure to maximize pricing power, not enough to threaten the business model. And that's just mechanism 1, the infrastructure trap. Mechanism 2 is why legal alternatives can't exist. This is mechanism 2, the settlement infrastructure monopoly. We've now revealed 2 of 5 mechanisms. Here's why this matters to you. There's a parallel financial system operating inside the US that's more efficient than Western Union, about processes $500 billion annually and exists solely because Congress made it illegal for banks to compete. You created the monopoly. Now you're paying $7.8 billion to fight it. The boardroom truth, $400 billion in street-level cash, has nowhere to go. Banking regulations don't just discourage money laundering. They make legitimate cash handling infrastructure impossible at this scale. Prohibition 1928. Chicago bootleggers laundered $100 million annually through legitimate businesses, but the scale was manageable. Today, $400 billion is 4,000 times larger than anything Prohibition produced. And unlike 1920s liquor consumed domestically, drug revenue is 100% cash that must physically cross borders. No banking system has ever handled that volume in untraceable currency. Cartels didn't choose cash. U.S. regulations forced them to build the only infrastructure capable of handling it. Walk through the logistics. A mid-sized distribution network in Houston generates $200 million annually. That's $4 million weekly in cash. Small bills, mostly 20s and 10s. You're looking at 200,000 individual bills per week. They weigh 440 pounds. They fill 12 banker's boxes. You can't deposit that in a bank without triggering immediate federal investigation. You can't wire it without treasury monitoring. You can't buy assets without creating audit trails. You can't convert it to cryptocurrency in meaningful volume without exchange reporting. You need bulk counting facilities, currency exchanges willing to process millions in small bills, armored transport, border crossing logistics, foreign bank access, and, critically, a network that does all this while remaining invisible to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Cartels built that network over 30 years. Here's the infrastructure. Counting houses, warehouse facilities with $2 million in commercial bill counters running 24-hour shifts. They process $50 to $100 million weekly, shrink wrap into $1 million bricks, vacuum seal for moisture protection, prepare for transport. These facilities are indistinguishable from Amazon fulfillment centers, except they're processing currency, not packages. Bulk transport, modified armored vehicles, semi-trucks with hidden compartments, passenger vehicles with $500,000 in door panels and spare tires. The innovation isn't smuggling drugs north, it's smuggling cash south. Northbound loads, drugs, are high margin and compact. Southbound loads, cash, are low margin and bulky, requiring different logistics. Border crossing strategy. 12,000 commercial vehicles cross major ports daily. Inspecting even 10% creates traffic backups that cost billions in legitimate trade delays. so inspection rates hover at 2 to 5%. Cartels embed cash in legitimate cargo flows. They don't need to beat security. They need to blend into volume. Foreign settlement, Mexican casas de cambio, currency exchanges, handle the conversion. These aren't criminal enterprises, they're licensed businesses, but regulations in Mexico allow them to process far larger cash volumes than U.S. banks. Cartel cash mixes with legitimate border commerce, tourism, remittances, trade, making it impossible to isolate without shutting down entire regional economies. The monopoly isn't violent. It's infrastructural. No bank can compete because regulations prohibit them from operating in this space. Here's what this means for you. The average U.S. household uses 8% of transactions in cash. The drug economy is 100% cash. That's a 12 times difference in physical currency volume. You've created a use case for an entirely parallel financial system, then acted surprised when someone built one. And here's the cost. That $400 billion isn't disappearing into Swiss banks anymore. It's being reinvested into logistics infrastructure that's now better than legitimate supply chains. Some cartel tunnels have rail systems, ventilation, and lighting better than New York subway stations. You funded that with prohibition. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. The settlement infrastructure creates secondary markets. Small-time smugglers who don't work for cartels directly can rent access to the repatriation network. It's Uber for drug money. A local dealer in Phoenix with $500,000 in cash can pay 15%, $75,000, to have it moved to Mexico and deposited in a bank account within 72 hours. The infrastructure is so efficient, it's become a service offering. This means cartels profit even from drugs they didn't traffic. Competitors using the same border corridors become customers of the cash repatriation service. The monopoly extracts rent from the entire black market. You might be thinking, why can't we just track the cash? Follow the money like we did with Al Capone. Here's the problem. Al Capone's operation generated $100 million annually in 1920s dollars. Today, that's $1.8 billion adjusted for inflation. The cartel cash flow is $400 billion, 220 times larger. FinCEN receives 2 million suspicious activity reports annually. They have 350 analysts. That's 5,714 reports per analyst per year. Even if they worked around the clock, they'd have 4 minutes per report. The volume has overwhelmed the monitoring system. And here's the deeper problem. Tracking requires financial institutions to flag suspicious activity. But the $400 billion never enters the financial system. It's physical cash, moving through physical infrastructure, converted at Mexican currency exchanges, operating legally under Mexican law. There's nothing to track until it's already settled. That's the infrastructure monopoly. Here's where it gets worse. Mechanism 3 is why your enforcement spending makes them richer. This is mechanism 3 of 5, involuntary margin support. We've now revealed 3 of 5 mechanisms. Here's why this matters to you. That record drug bust you saw on the news, the one where authorities seized $300 million worth of cocaine, you just funded a $4 billion margin expansion for the cartels. Every interdiction success is an earnings call for the enemy. The boardroom truth, supply interdiction without demand. Reduction is margin expansion. Economics 101, reduce supply, price rises. When demand is inelastic, addiction, buyers don't consume less. They just pay more. Prohibition enforcement, 1929. Federal agents seized 11,860 illegal distilleries that year, believing they were winning. But every shutdown increased the value of remaining operations. Yeah, bootleggers who survived enforcement could charge 20% more because competitors were removed from the market. By 1931, per-gallon prices had tripled from 1920 levels despite zero change in production costs. Modern drug interdiction replicates this exactly. In 2023, Border Patrol seized record amounts, 10,000 pounds of fentanyl and 280 tons of cocaine. And street prices rose 12% that year because the 90% that crossed successfully became more valuable. Look at the math. Border Patrol intercepts 10 tons of cocaine at a checkpoint. Street value, $300 million. Press conference. Congressional testimony, major victory. Meanwhile, that month, 90 tons crossed successfully through other corridors. Those 90 tons were going to sell for $2.7 billion at baseline prices. But because supply just contracted 10% and street prices rise 15% over the next 6 weeks, the 90 tons now sell for $3.1 billion. The interdiction cost taxpayers $50 million in operation costs, detention, prosecution. The cartels netted $400 million in margin expansion. You funded both sides. Here's how the mechanism works, and this is the part that should concern you. Demand inelasticity. 20 million Americans have substance use disorders. These aren't discretionary consumers. They're pharmacologically dependent. When cocaine prices rise 20%, they don't reduce consumption 20%. Studies show demand drops less than 5%. That's a 0.25 elasticity coefficient, meaning demand is almost perfectly inelastic. Think about insulin pricing. If insulin doubles in price, diabetics don't cut their dose in half. They pay the new price. Addiction creates the same dynamic. Supply fungibility. Seize a shipment in San Diego and production in Colombia doesn't change. The cocaine already exists. It just gets redirected to Laredo or El Paso. Arrest a distributor in Chicago and someone fills the vacancy within 72 hours because the customer base, addicts needing daily fixes, doesn't disappear. Bottom line on the margin math, production cost for cocaine is $500 per kilo in Colombia. Add smuggling costs, bribes, logistics, losses. It's $2,000 per kilo delivered to U.S. border. Current street price, $75,000 per kilo. That's a 37 times markup. If interdiction removes 15% of supply and prices rise 15%, the successful 85% now sells for $86,250 per kilo. Revenue goes from $63.75 billion, 850 tons at $75,000, to $73.3 billion, 850 tons at $86,250. That's a $9.5 billion margin expansion on the same delivered volume. The enforcement paradox. DEA and Border Patrol are evaluated on seizure metrics. More seizures equals more funding. But seizures make the remaining product more valuable, increasing cartel profits, which funds better evasion infrastructure, requiring more enforcement budget. You've created a positive feedback loop where success metrics, tons seized, are inversely correlated with strategic objectives, reducing cartel power. Here's what this means for you. In 2019, Border Patrol seized record amounts. 280 tons of cocaine, 10,000 pounds of meth. Street value, $8 billion. Sounds like winning. But here's the data. Total cocaine consumption in the U.S. didn't drop. It increased 3% that year, CDC data. Sherry, meaning the 280 tons seized just made the remaining supply more expensive. Street prices rose 8 to 12% across major markets. Those price increases don't hurt cartels. They're selling the product. They hurt users who commit property crimes to fund purchases. Your car break-in, your stolen package, your neighborhood burglary. That's the retail consequence of inelastic demand meeting artificial scarcity. And here's where it gets worse. The margin expansion funds infrastructure upgrades. After major interdiction operations, cartels don't scale back. They innovate. Example, when tunnel detection technology improved in 2015, cartels shifted to semi-submersibles. When drone surveillance expanded in 2018, they moved to fentanyl. 50 times concentration reduction equals 98% smaller interdiction surface. Como si, when El Chapo's Sinaloa tunnels were discovered, 150 plus tunnels, $50 million construction costs, enforcement celebrated. The cartel response? Build submarines, single-use, disposable, $2 million each, carry 7 tons of cocaine, $200 million street value. Use once, sink it, build another. The margin supports the innovation cycle. You might be thinking, but if we don't interdict, drugs flood in unopposed. We have to do something. Here's the problem with that assumption. You're already not stopping it. DEA's own data. Interdiction rates are 10 to 15% for cocaine, 8 to 12% for methamphetamine, meaning 85 to 90% crosses successfully. And here's the deeper trap. The current interdiction rate might be optimal for cartels. If it dropped to 5%, oversupply would crash prices and compress margins. If it rose to 30%, cartels would shift entirely to fentanyl, already happening, which is 50 times more concentrated, reducing the physical volume that needs to cross borders by 98%. The fentanyl shift is Exhibit A. When interdiction pressure increased on bulky heroin and cocaine, cartels responded with a product that delivers the same street value in 2% of the physical volume. 1 kilogram of fentanyl equals 50 kilograms of heroin in street value. Interdiction effectiveness collapsed by 98% in a single product cycle. If you understand nothing else, understand this. There is one scenario that breaks this mechanism: demand destruction via treatment and legalization. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, redirected enforcement budgets to treatment. Result: drug deaths dropped 90%. AR addiction rates fell by half. Cartels lost pricing power because users could access regulated supply. But here's why it won't happen in the US. Political cost of legalization exceeds political cost of continuing failure. No senator wants the attack ad. Senator X voted to legalize cocaine. Even if the policy would work, the optics are politically fatal. That was involuntary margin support, where your tax dollars become cartel revenue. Mechanism 4 is why the customers can't escape. This is Mechanism 4, the demand inelasticity trap. We've revealed 4 of 5 mechanisms. This is where the customer base becomes a trapped revenue stream. Here's why this matters to you. 20 million Americans have substance use disorders. When drug prices rise, they don't quit. They commit more crime to fund purchases. Your insurance premium, your car break-in, your stolen Amazon package, those aren't random. They're the retail consequences of inelastic demand. The boardroom truth: addicted users are price-insensitive customers with lifetime value exceeding $500,000 each. Cartels don't need to acquire new customers or manage churn. Pharmacology does the retention. Prohibition, 1930. Federal Narcotics Bureau estimated 100,000 opium addicts, mostly from medical prescriptions, legal until 1914. When supply was criminalized, prices rose 500%, but addiction rates stayed flat. Addicts turned to crime at scale to fund purchases. Property crime in major cities doubled from 1925 to 1933. The drug problem wasn't consumption, it was the crime wave created when addicts couldn't afford prohibition-inflated prices. Today, 20 million substance use disorders, same dynamic, at a 1,000 times larger scale. Walk through the user economics. Average opioid-addicted person needs $200 per day to avoid withdrawal. That's $73,000 annually. Most users don't have that income legally, so they generate it illegally: shoplifting, burglary, copper theft, selling possessions, sex work, middleman dealing. The National Institute on Drug Abuse estimates addicted users commit 5 to 10 property crimes weekly to fund purchases. Scale that across 2 million opioid users and 18 million total substance users. You're looking at 20 to 40 million property crimes annually driven by funding needs, not criminal intent. Here's how the demand trap works. Pharmacological dependency, addiction, rewires brain reward pathways. It's not a choice or moral failing. It's a medical condition where the brain requires the substance to maintain neurochemical baseline. Stopping without treatment causes physical withdrawal for opioids, psychological collapse for stimulants, or life-threatening seizures for alcohol. The elasticity data is stark. Normal consumer goods, 10% price increase equals 5 to 8% demand. Reduction, elasticity around 0.6. Gasoline, 10% price increase equals 2 to 3% demand. Reduction, elasticity 0.25. Cigarettes, addictive. 10% price increase equals 1 to 2% demand reduction. Elasticity 0.15. Heroin and cocaine, 20% price increase equals 0 to 5% demand reduction. Elasticity less than 0.1. Cartels aren't selling discretionary products. They're selling pharmacological necessity to a captive customer base. Lifetime value calculation. Average addiction duration, 7 to 15 years. Daily spend, $100 to $300 depending on substance. Lifetime customer value, $250,000 to $1.6 million. Customer acquisition cost is 0. First dose often free or discounted. Pharmacology ensures retention. Compare that to legal businesses. Netflix lifetime value around $2,000. Customer acquisition cost $80. Cartels have 100 times better unit economics than subscription services. So what does this actually mean? The crime externality. When prices rise 20%, users don't reduce consumption. They increase illegal income generation. The cost doesn't stay with the user. It externalizes to society. Shoplifting. $100 billion annually. Retail Industry Leaders Association data. Burglary. $3.4 billion in losses. FBI data. Auto theft. $8 billion annually. Property crime insurance claims. $25 billion. Estimate 30 to 40% of property crime is addiction funded. That's $50 to $60 billion in annual social cost from the demand inelasticity trap. Here's what this means for you. Your homeowner's insurance premium has risen 35% in the last decade. Part of that is climate risk, but 20 to 30% is property crime increases. The insurance industry doesn't distinguish between random burglary and addiction-funded burglary. They just price in the aggregate theft rate. You're paying twice. Once in taxes for enforcement, $7.8 billion. Again in insurance premiums and stolen property, $50+ billion externalized costs. But here's the problem. The inelastic demand creates market stability cartels used for planning. Legal businesses face demand volatility. Recessions reduce consumer spending, but addiction doesn't respond to economic cycles. The 2008 financial crisis reduced consumer spending 7%. Drug consumption dropped 0.3%. This stability enables long-term infrastructure investment. When you know demand will persist regardless of economic conditions, you can finance $50 million tunnels with 10-year payback periods. Legal businesses can't model revenue with that certainty. You might be thinking, treatment can solve this. We just need more rehab beds. Here's the problem. Current treatment capacity is 2 million beds, SAMHSA data, for 20 million people with substance use disorders. Even if you fully funded treatment, estimated $50 billion annually, you're facing average treatment success rate 40 to 60%, meaning 40 to 60% relapse. On our treatment duration, 90+ days. Throughput, around 8 million people annually at full capacity. The math, at 50% success rate, treating 20 million people, requires 2.5 cycles, 12 to 15 years to clear the backlog, assuming 0 new addictions. Impossible given current prescription opioid prescribing rates. 50 million Americans receive opioid prescriptions annually. Treatment is necessary but insufficient. Without addressing supply-side pricing, legalization, and regulation, you're treating symptoms while the underlying economic incentives create new addicts faster than treatment can process them. That's the demand trap. Pharmacology as customer retention. Mechanism 5 is why the enforcers can't quit either. This is mechanism 5 of 5. The asset forfeiture revenue dependency. Those are the 5 mechanisms. Here's why none of them break. Here's why this matters to you. The agencies fighting the drug war are now financially dependent on it continuing. $4.5 billion in annual asset seizures funds 30 to 40% of some local law enforcement budgets. If the drug trade ended tomorrow, they'd face layoffs and budget cuts. The incentive isn't to solve the problem, it's to manage it sustainably. The boardroom truth, asset forfeiture laws allow agencies to keep 80% of cash and assets seized in drug operations. That's not taxpayer funding. That's self-generated revenue with zero congressional appropriation oversight. Prohibition enforcement, 1925 to 1933. Federal Bureau of Prohibition grew from 1,500 to 4,500 agents, budget from $5 million to $15 million annually. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the Bureau dissolved overnight, 4,500 jobs eliminated. Agencies learned solving the problem ends the budget. Modern Asset Forfeiture Laws, 1984. Comprehensive Crime Control Act ensure agencies profit from ongoing enforcement, not from solving the problem. Result, $4.5 billion annual seizures with 80% retained by seizing agencies. Some sheriff departments now get 40% of operating budgets from drug forfeitures. Look at the incentive structure. A county sheriff department in Texas seizes $2 million in cartel cash during a traffic stop. Under federal asset forfeiture law, equitable sharing, they keep $1.6 million, 80%. That pays for new vehicles, equipment, overtime, training. Next budget cycle, the county commissioners see that revenue line and reduce general fund allocation by $1.5 million. Saw if the department is now structurally dependent on drug seizures to maintain staffing levels. Here's how it works. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 created equitable sharing, allowing local and state agencies to keep 80% of federally forfeited assets. Intent: incentivize drug enforcement. Outcome: budget dependency. Current scale 2023 federal asset forfeitures $4.5 billion. Local and state share 80%, $3.6 billion. Departments with 20% or more of budget from forfeitures 1,200 plus agencies. Departments with 40% or more of budget from forfeitures 300 plus agencies. Institute for Justice data. The dependency creates mission drift. Success metrics shift from reduce drug trafficking to maximize asset seizures. Internal performance reviews reward agents who generate forfeiture revenue. Here's what this means for you. Civil asset forfeiture doesn't require criminal conviction. If you're pulled over with $10,000 in cash, the agency can seize it on suspicion it's drug-related. You must prove it's legitimate, reversing burden of proof. In 2019, $500 million was seized from people never charged with crimes. That's not cartel money. That's citizens caught in a revenue generation system. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. The dependency creates lobbying pressure against policy change. When cannabis legalization bills reach state legislatures, law enforcement agencies testify against them, not on public safety grounds, but because legalization would reduce forfeiture revenue. Example: California legalization. 2016 reduced marijuana seizures 75%. Knee agencies that had relied on cannabis forfeitures faced budget shortfalls and lobbied to slow retail licensing, keeping black market active longer. You might be thinking, forfeitures hurt cartels by taking their money. Here's the problem. $4.5 billion in annual seizures sounds significant until you compare it to $400 billion in total revenue. That's 1.1% shrinkage. Walmart has higher inventory loss rates from shoplifting. And seizures raise prices. Mechanism 3, increasing cartel margins enough to offset losses. The economic impact is net positive for cartels while creating institutional capture of enforcement agencies. Those are the 5 mechanisms. The system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as designed, with incentives that prevent anyone from exiting. Same border checkpoint, and same 12,000 vehicles crossing daily. Same 2% inspection rate. Different numbers on the screen. 2010, $2.1 billion DEA budget. 280 tons cocaine seized. Street prices, $62,000 per kilo. 2024, $3.1 billion DEA budget. 280 tons cocaine seized. Street prices, $75,000 per kilo. The interdiction rate stayed flat. The budget increased 48%. The cartels raised prices 21%. You didn't reduce their power. You paid them to optimize. The question was never whether to fight cartels. It was whether anyone would notice that every mechanism, the empty core, the settlement monopoly, the margin support, the demand trap, the forfeiture dependency, all 5 were designed to perpetuate the problem, not solve it. The timeline is faster than anyone wants to admit. Fentanyl concentration has already collapsed interdiction effectiveness 98%. The mechanisms are locked in, and the political cost of exit exceeds the cost of continuation. Same room, same screen, different numbers. The terms already changed. You just kept paying both sides.